The things we regret most are rarely the things we did. They're the things we didn't do. The conversation we kept putting off. The call we meant to make. The thing we felt but didn't say because there always seemed to be more time. Dean Martin spent most of his public life wearing one of the most comfortable faces anyone has ever worn in front of a camera. The relaxed ease, the warmth without effort, the glass of something amber, the loosened tie, the sense that whatever else was happening in the world, Dean Martin was in a room somewhere having a genuinely good time. It was a persona that worked enormously across television and film and concert stages and recordings, and it was not entirely a fiction. Dean Martin was, by most accounts, a man who genuinely preferred the uncomplicated, who had a real and durable warmth, who could put people at ease simply by being in the room. But underneath the ease was a man who had complicated feelings about some of the most important relationships in his life, who felt things he often didn't quite know how to say, who expressed warmth more easily through presence and performance than through direct declaration, and who carried, into his later years, some regrets about words that had gone unsaid for too long. Particularly with Jerry Lewis. The partnership, 10 years of films, of television, of an unprecedented joint stardom that had made them, for a period in the 1950s, the most popular comedy duo in America, had ended abruptly and without real resolution in 1956. The split had been sudden and painful, and neither man had ever quite explained it fully or fully repaired it. For decades, the silence between them was public knowledge. Dean Martin didn't talk about the split often. He had a particular way, when difficult emotional subjects arose, of deflecting, not unkindly, but consistently. The ease that worked so well professionally served a protective function personally, keeping certain things at a distance that might have been examined if the ease hadn't been available. But in the later years, especially after the death of his son Dino in 1987, a loss that shattered him in ways he never fully recovered from, the protective ease became harder to maintain. And in conversations in those years, he was more willing to acknowledge that there were things he wished had been different, including the friendship he had lost. He and Jerry Lewis eventually reconnected publicly in a famous moment on television in 1976, an event so unexpected and so emotionally charged that the audience didn't know quite how to respond. And in their later years, there was warmth between them, carefully tended, acknowledging the distance without fully closing it, but real. Something had been said, eventually, that brought them back into some version of closeness. Not everything, but something. Enough to move the situation from pure estrangement to something more like imperfect reconciliation. Dean Martin said, in one of his rare, candid moments, that he wished he had done it sooner. Not in a dramatic way, just that simple recognition that the years when nothing was said were years when something could have been, and that the eventual saying of it had brought something he hadn't expected. Not closure, exactly. Some distances can't be fully closed. But the particular relief of having said what he felt, rather than continuing to carry it in the more private form of something unsaid. Maybe you felt that kind of carrying. Maybe there is something in your own life, a friendship that went cold, a relationship that ended without proper resolution, a person with whom there are things that were never quite said that you've been carrying in that way. Not actively painful most of the time, just present. A faint weight in the background. The awareness that something was left incomplete, that the situation could be different than it is, that you could do something about it if you were willing to take the risk of reaching and not knowing what would come back. Most people wait for the other person to go first, or wait for the situation to become easier on its own, or wait for the right moment, the perfect occasion, the ideal circumstances, the version of reaching out that doesn't require any vulnerability because the outcome is already assured. That moment very rarely comes. The outcome is never assured, and the waiting tends to make the reaching harder rather than easier, as the gap grows and the weight of the unsaid accumulates. Here's something gentle to consider. You don't have to say everything to say something. The conversation doesn't have to resolve the whole history. You don't have to justify everything or explain everything or arrive at a formal accounting of who did what and why. You just have to make a move. A message, a call, a simple reaching out that says, "I've been thinking about you. I miss what we had. I'm sorry for whatever part of the distance was mine. I'd like to see if we can find our way back to something." That's enough. Often that's more than enough, because the other person has been carrying something too, and the move you make, the willingness to go first, to risk the vulnerability of reaching without certainty, gives them permission to meet you, which they often have been wanting to do, and not quite knowing how to begin. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis had lost 20 years before they found their way back. 20 years in which, by most accounts, both men thought about the friendship more than they let on. And what finally closed the gap wasn't any dramatic resolution of what had gone wrong. It was simply two people deciding, separately and then together, that the friendship mattered more than whatever had ended it. That some version of what they'd had was worth recovering, and that the risk of being vulnerable enough to try was worth taking, even after all the years and all the distance. Maybe there is someone in your life for whom something similar is true. Not necessarily an old friendship, maybe a family member, a colleague, a neighbor from a chapter of your life that has since moved on. Someone with whom something accumulated and went unresolved, and who has been present in your thoughts more than you've acknowledged. Maybe this is the week to do something with that presence, to let the fact that you're still thinking about them be a reason to act, rather than a thing to manage. The window isn't always as open as it seems. People age and lose touch and move and die, and the particular moment for a particular kind of reaching out passes with them. But while the window is open, while the person is there in some reachable form, the option is there too. And acting on it tends to produce something that carrying it privately can never quite provide. The particular relief of something that was stuck, now moving, of a weight that was carried, now set down, even partially, of the knowledge that you said what you felt before it was too late to say it. Dean Martin wished he'd said it sooner. That's worth remembering. The time to say it is usually earlier than we think, and it's almost always now. So take a slow breath, and maybe, this week, say the thing you've been carrying to whoever needs to hear it. Not perfectly, not with everything resolved, just honestly, and with whatever warmth you can bring. That's always enough to begin. There's one more dimension of regret worth sitting with. Something about the way it tends to be focused outward, on what we left unsaid to others, while a different kind of regret gets less attention. The things we never quite said to ourselves. The honest acknowledgments we kept postponing. The versions of our own story that we never quite looked at clearly enough to really understand. Dean Martin's ease was real, genuine warmth, genuine humor, a genuine preference for the uncomplicated. But it was also, at times, a way of not fully accounting for things, of letting the ease carry him past situations that deserved more careful examination. And the regrets he carried in his later years were, in part, about this, about the cost of the ease, about what it had allowed him to avoid facing, for how long, and what it had cost him in relationships that mattered. Most of us have some version of this, a defense that served us well for a long time, and that eventually revealed a cost that we hadn't fully accounted for. The habit of deflection that kept conversations light but prevented them from being real. The tendency to minimize difficulty that made us easier to be around, but harder to be close to. The particular form of protection that worked when we were young, and that, examined carefully in the later years, turns out to have been more costly than it appeared. These recognitions don't need to be occasions for self-judgment. Dean Martin's ease, at its best, was genuinely one of his gifts. It made rooms better, made people happier, made a particular kind of warmth available that the world needed and received. The regret wasn't that the ease existed. It was that it was allowed to do all the heavy lifting, even when what a situation needed was something harder and more honest. The recognition is specific. In this particular area, I could have done better. Not, I was wrong to be who I was. Maybe there is something like this in your own reckoning, an honest acknowledgement of something specific that didn't serve you or the people you loved as well as it could have. Not a comprehensive verdict on your life. Just a clear, honest, specific acknowledgement. This is something I wish I'd done differently. This is something I understand better now than I did then. This is something I want to do differently going forward, where forward is still possible. That kind of honest reckoning, specific, clear, without unnecessary self-punishment, is one of the most useful things a person can do in the later chapters. It clears the air. It creates room for something more genuine in what comes next. And it gives you the particular satisfaction of no longer carrying something that was always, underneath everything, simply asking to be looked at. Dean Martin found, in the reconciliation with Jerry Lewis, something he hadn't known he was looking for until it arrived. Not the dramatic resolution of everything, just the particular piece of having finally said what he'd been carrying. Of having moved from the private regret to the expressed one, and finding that the other person was ready to meet him there. Maybe someone is waiting to meet you there, too. Maybe you're the one who needs to go first. Maybe the thing you've been carrying is lighter than you think once you finally say it. So take a slow breath, and maybe, this week, say the thing you've been meaning to say to someone who needs to hear it, or to yourself in the quiet, in the form of an honest accounting that you've been postponing. Either way, say it. Dean Martin knew the cost of waiting. You don't have to learn it the same way.